It doesn't matter.
Again. Hotziu lo et hakaf yatamachta. So they took out for him, for the Kohen Gadol, the kaf, which was like a large spoon or a scoop, yatamachta, which would be uh, the kli that holds the coals, the chafan below chafnav, v'natan letoch hakaf. So then he would grab, full fistfuls and put them into the kaf. So, so first of all, in addition to the kaf and the machta, what else did they bring out for him? What is he grabbing here? What's he grabbing?
Ketoret.
So what else did they bring out for him?
Ketoret.
The Ktoret. Okay. So we'll see why the Mishnah only mentions the kaf and the machta. The idea that they brought out the Ktoret for him, that's assumed. But the kaf and the machta, as we'll see in a moment, those are the things that then he has to carry. Okay, and we saw this last week. Chafan velo chafnav. He had to grab 2 handfuls, 2 fistfuls, and put them into the kaf. Hagadol lefi godlo, v'akatan lefi katno, v'kach hayta midata. The big one according to his bigness, and the small one according to his smallness, and that was its measure. Okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean that the big according to the big and the small according to the small?
Well, as Marco Rubio would say, the size of his hands.
Okay, and what's the emphasis here? Why does the Mishnah have to tell us that?
Meaning that the amount of Ketoret depends on the size of his hands rather than some objective measure.
Right. So I think it's an interesting point to consider, which I know we mentioned last time, but I want to emphasize it again. Natal et hamachta bimino. So he would take the coal pan in his right hand, and he would take the kaf, that had the ktoret, in his left hand. Now, we haven't learned this, I think, prior, but elsewhere in the Mishnah, not here in Yoma, but in Zvachim and other places, we learned that avodah, right, service in the temple, has to be done with the right hand. It's pasul in the left hand. And this is an exception. This is an exception, and I believe the Bartanur will mention this, or at least he'll allude to it. We'll see this, but this is an exception. Haya mehalech b'heichal, so he would walk in through the heichal, ad shemagia levein shtei haparochot hamavdilot bein hakodesh uvein kodesh hakodeshim uveinehen ama, until he got to the curtains that divided between the holy and the holy of holies, and in between them was an amma, right? The space of 1 amma. Rabbi Yossi Omer lo hayta sham ela farochet achad bilvad. Yossi said there only one curtain. Shenamar v'hivdila haparochet lachem bein hakodesh uvein kodesh hakodeshim. When the Torah mandates the curtain, it indicates that there's one parochet, because it says in the singular, and the parochet will divide for you between the holy and the holy of holies. It doesn't say parochot, and we'll look at that in a moment. But you remember when the Torah gives instructions about how to build the Mishkan, The instructions are only for one parochet, and that's the only one that's mentioned. So the question is, so what's the basis for the machloket between Rabbi Yossi and the Tanna Kama? The Tanna Kama says that there were two. Rabbi Yossi says there was one. Rabbi Yossi brings pretty solid proof to indicate that there was only one. So we'll see that also in a moment. החיצונה הייתה פרופה מן הדרום, והפנימית מן הצפון. So the outer one was curled back or clasped back from the south, and the inner one was clasped back from the north. So, so the outer what and the inner what? What are we talking about here?
Outer and the inner paroch.
Okay, and so this Mishnah, this part of the Mishnah goes according to whom?
Tanakama.
The Tanakama, right? So the Mishnah is proceeding with the opinion of the Tanakama that there were two drapes, there were two parochot. Mahalech beinehen. So he would enter from the south. He would walk between them ad shemagia letzafon until he reached the north. Higia letzafon, he reached the north. Hofech panav ledarom. Then he would turn his face south. Mahalech lismolo im haparochet ad shehu magia la'aron. Then he would walk to his left with the parochet until he reached the Aron. So the step that's not explicit but is implicit is that once he gets to the north, it says then he turns his face south. But once he got to the north, what did he do before he turned his face south?
Had to enter through the prochet.
Yeah, so he entered. So presumably he got up to the north, then immediately he would turn his face west, enter, and then turn his face south. Because then he's walking along the parochet inside the Kodesh HaKodeshim until he would reach the Aron. He got to the Aron, Higia la'Aron, noten et ha'machta bein shnei habadim. He would put the machta between the two rods of the Aron. Tzavar et ha'ktoret al gabei gechalim. He would pile the ktoret onto the coals. V'nitmalei chol habayit kulo ashan. And the entire house, the entire room, would be filled with smoke. Yatsa uvalo b'derech beit kanisato. He would go out, he would exit and go in the way that he had come in. Meaning what?
Between the two curtains.
Yes, so presumably he does everything opposite. Then he would go face north, go to the opening in the curtain that's at the north side, turn right, which would be east, and then turn right again, which would be south. He'd go down to the south wall and then turn to his left, facing again east, and then leave. Umitpalel tefillah ktsara b'bayit hachitzon. He would pray a short prayer in the outer room. The outer room being
Kodesh. Or the
the
Hechal.
Kodesh. The Heichal, also right, the Kodesh, which is also known as the Heichal. V'lo haya ma'arich b'tfilato shelo lahab'it et Yisrael. And he would not go at length with his prayers so as not to strike fear in Israel, right? So the people wouldn't be afraid of what? What would they be afraid of?
And he didn't make it out alive.
Yes, that he died inside, because That's something that apparently actually had happened. Okay, so we raised some questions last time. One of them is about the machloket between Rabbi Yossi and the Tanakama. We'll look into that a little bit today. But let's start with going back to the Mishnah with the Bartanura. So, Hotziu lo et hakaf et hamachta. The Bartanura says milishkat kelim. Right, there was a place in one of the shakot, one of the rooms that held kelim that were used in the Beit HaMikdash, so they would take out for him the kaf and the machta for this purpose. And
before he entered, wait, before he entered the Hechal, something's wrong.
yeah, there's like a
There's
reverberation.
something wrong.
I think you're okay
Okay.
now.
So there's a problem when because he has only two hands. How can he? In one hand he has got the kaf, in the other the machta, and he needs his two hands to take to lift the ktoret. The ktoret is on the Mizbach HaZahav, or where is it?
So this Ktoret, so there's going to be, he's going to bring the regular Ktoret, right? Because that's part of the the Avodah Tamidit. But this is the Ktoret as we see from the Mishnah. This is a different Ktoret that was special for Yom Kippurim that he burns inside the Kodesh HaKodashim. So right, so there's a practical issue when they say they bring out for him the kaf and the machta, and like we said, so what did they do? They brought out for him really three things, because they brought out the kaf, the machta, and they would have to have brought out also the ktoret for him to like
But it's written that the Kohen HaGadol himself chafan melo chofna.
yeah,
No?
and yes, and that's what he's doing. That's
so
what
he needs his two hands to do it, and his two hands are occupied.
Okay, so Yesh Lomar that at this point he has not yet, they brought out for him the kaf and the machta, but he has not yet lifted them up. So before he would, presumably, right? I'll show you this. We'll do a little.
Where is he? Where is he?
So
at that point.
He's
Where
in
is
the
Ktoret? Where's the Ktoret? Yes.
Okay, so the Ktoret, if I recall correct, I ran a little short on preparation today because actually I got interested in something else pertinent to this, but that's my excuse. I believe we learned that the Ktoret was prepared in Beit of Tinas, which was one of the Shakot that was toward the eastern side of the Azara. So they would have presumed, and then I think we mentioned this, right? That on Yom Kippurim they had to take Ktoret. They had to take a special measure of Ktoret and bring it back to the mortar and pestle to crush it again, right? It had to be daka min hadaka. So this was the special Ktoret that was used for this purpose on Yom Kippurim. So presumably they brought it from Beit of Tinas, and he would have been in the Azara to do this, to do what the Mishnah here is talking about.
So he didn't yet enter the Hechal at that point.
Right. So because we know that, right? Because it says only after he's taken the Ktoret, right? A little bit later in the Mishnah, Natal tamachta b'yamino v'takaf b'smalo. So after he measures out the Ktoret with his hands, then he would take the machta in his right hand and the kaf in his left hand, and then he would go into the Hechal. I'll show you this. I'll show you the Rambam's summary. We'll take a moment. We'll look at this. Oh, hold on a second. Okay. So the Rambam in the 4th chapter. Oh no, this is a different Rambam. Wait a second. I opened this before. Not there. Oof. Here we go. Okay. And for those of you who are interested, you can take your time and look at this. The Rambam in the 4th chapter of Hilchot Avodat Yom Kippurim, until now he's been explaining a lot of the things that we've learned so far in the Mishnah, which of course are bolstered by things from the Gemara, and now he starts to put it all together. So I think we'll take a moment, let's look at this, and then we'll get up to the part that we are at now. So this is what the Rambam says. Seder kol hamaasim shebeyom hazeh kachu. This is the order of all the things that were done this day. So what the Rambam is going to do here, he's going to incorporate things that we learned elsewhere in Masechet Tamid with the things that we learned in Masechet Yoma, so that we understand all of the things, right? Because the Mishnah in Yoma doesn't lay out all of the things that the Kohen Gadol did that day, because it assumes that the things that he did that were done every day, you learn elsewhere. So now, but the Rambam is going to meld them to give you the actual schedule of events. So around midnight, Mefisin Trumat HaDeshen, they would do the payis for the Trumat HaDeshen, Umesadrin et Amaracha, Medashnin et Hamizbech, Geder she'osin kol yom al haseder shebe'erno. So they would start off the day the same way that we saw in Masechet Tamid. They would set up the ma'aracha, and they would remove the deshen the way they would do in the order that they did every day, as we have explained, ad she'yagiu l'shchitat tamid, until they would get to the point they had to shech the korban tamid. Kisheyagiu l'shchot et tamid, so at the point that they're going to shech the korban tamid, porsin sadin shel bots bein kohen gadol vein ha'am, they would put up this drape, this curtain of fine linen between the Kohen Gadol and the people, the Lamashel boats, Kadesh Yakir Shavadat Yom B'Bigdei boats, so everybody would know that today he's going to do avodah in special linen clothing. Ufoshet Bigdei Chol v'Tovel, V'Lovesh Bigdei Zahav v'Mekadesh Yadav v'Raglav. Now this part we saw, right? So that the Kohen Gadol, before he starts, he has to remove his everyday clothes, and he has to tavel. He has to tavel actually right before he enters into the Azara, at next to Shar Hamayim. Belovesh Bigdei Zahav, he would put on his golden clothes, which is daily Kohen Gadol clothes, his regular Kohen Gadol clothes. Umekadesh Yadav Raglav, and he would wash his hands and his legs. Ushochet B'Tamid Rov Shnayim, he would shech the korban tamid, most of the two simanim of the animal. In other words, most of the kaneh and the veshet, the windpipe and the jugular vein. He would let somebody else finish off the shchita. Mekabel hadam, then he would receive the blood, because that was an avodah. V'zorko hamizbeach kamitzvoto, and he would sprinkle that onto the mizbeach according to its mitzvah, right, which was the sprinkling in the northeast corner and the southwest corner. Then he would go into the heichal and bring the ketoret that was brought every day in the morning. Umeitiv et hanerot, and he would he would fix the lights on the menorah, which, as we know from Masechet Tamid, that was normally done by two kohanim, That was two separate paisot. Today the Kohen Gadol has to do it, so he goes in to do that. Maktir Evarei HaTamid, then he would go back and he would take the limbs of the Korban Tamid and bring them onto the Mizbeach. V'hachabitin, right, the meal offering, v'anisachim, the wine offerings, kachol seder hatamid shel kol yom shebe'erno, like what was done every day, the same way that was done every day. V'achar tamid makriv hapar v'shivat hakvasim shel musaf hayom. So then afterwards he would bring the par and the bull and the seven sheep for the musaf of Yom Kippur. V'achar kach mekadesh yadav v'raglav uposhet bigdei zahav. Then he would go ahead, wash his hands and legs again, remove his golden clothes. The tovel, he would go to the mikvah, and this mikvah is the one that's on Beit HaParva. It's inside of the Azara. V'tovel v'lovesh bigdei lavan u'mekadesh yadav v'raglav. So he would change into the bigdei lavan, wash his hands and legs again. Uvalo etzel paro. Then he would come next to his bull. Paro hayomed bein halulam v'lamizbeach, rosho l'darom l'fanav l'ma'arav, as we saw in the Mishnah in the third chapter. It was between the ulam and the mizbeach, and it was situated that it was going south to north, right, with the head at the south and the tail at the north. But he would turn the head of the bull so that it would face west, and he was to the east of it, so that he could also face west toward the Heichal. He would put his two hands on the head of the bull, and he would say the confessional, V'kacha yaomer, Ana Hashem chatati aviti pashati lefanecha ni uveiti, Ana Hashem kaperna lechatayim v'lavonot v'lepsha'im shechatati v'sha'aviti v'shepashati lefanecha ni uveiti, kakatu b'torat Moshe avdecha lemor, ki b'yam hazeh chaper lechem b'teretchem mikol chatoteichem livnei Hashem titaru. Okay, so that's the vidui that we saw in the Mishnah. And it's the same as in the Mishnah, except for the order of Chatati Aviti Pashati, which the Rambam paskin like the Chachamim against Rabbi Meir, that you put Chatati first. So this is what we saw in the fourth chapter of Yoma, that that's Taraf Bekalpi. He would do the lots for the two goats. Then kosher. The Rambam here is condensing, because he explained these things in the earlier chapters in greater detail. So he's just giving you the basic actions. The kosher lashon shel zahorit b'rosh hamishtalech. Then he would tie the crimson ribbon on the head of the goat that's going to be sent off. Umamido keneged beit shiluchov, and the nishchat keneged beit shchitato. So they would stand the seir that's going to be sent away across from where it's going to be sent out, and it's presumably in front of the gate they're going to lead it out from. And then he would tie l'nishchat, in other words, he would tie the crimson ribbon on the neck, the Beit Shchita, the place where the other goat is going to be slaughtered. Then, Uvalo Etzel Parosh Shniya, he would come to his par a second time. And then he would say the second vidui, which was the same as the first one, except that here he says Ani Uveti, and he adds in Uvnei Aharonam Kodoshecha. Now he does the vidui for all of the Kohanim, etc. ואחר כך שוחט את הפר. So at this point now that he shechts the par, מקבל את דמו ונותנו למישהו. Right, so the Rambam here also doesn't say that we know, and he alluded to this earlier with the Tamid. He does the shechita the same way, where he does most of the shechita so that it's kosher, and then he hands off the knife to another kohen to finish it, and then he grabs the kli to that's going to capture the blood, and then he gives it to somebody shuhu v'nad nado shelo yikaresh. So he gives it to somebody that's going to move it around, stir it around, so that it won't congeal, the blood won't congeal. Al harovat aravi'i shel ha'echal mibachutz, on the fourth level outside of the Heichal, and we looked at that. We looked at some, at least one or two of the Deot about exactly where that was, but it's somewhere, it's somewhere in front of the opening to the Ulam, actually. ונוטל את המחתה, וחוטא באש מעל המזבח מן הסמוך למערב. So he goes to then he takes the machta, which we described as a special machta that's used on Yom Kippur, that was made of gold, and it was smaller than usual. It had a longer handle than usual. And he would go and he would get the coals from the mizbeach, from the maracha that was close to the west side maracha. Shene'amar me'al mizbeach milifnei Hashem, that he had to take coals from the mizbeach before Hashem, so it was the one that was closer, as it were, to the Heichal. V'yoreid minichal harovan shabazara, then he would put that down on a row of stones that was in, or a row of flooring that was in the Azara. Umotziim lo et hakaf. Now see, the Rambam here changes a little bit the way we see it in the Mishnah. This is what we're up to. So, according to this, he took the machta before, which actually was in the Mishnah earlier, that he already had, the machta was already out, because he already took off coals from the Mizbeach. So here the Rambam doesn't say, our Mishnah says, Hotzia lo et hakaf et machta. Here the Rambam says, Motzin lo et hakaf, ukli malek toret daka min hadaka. They brought out for him the kaf and a kli that was filled with this specially refined ktoret. B'chofen mimena melo chafnav, and then he takes with his hands, right, full handfuls of ktoret, lo mechukot, v'lo gedushot, ele tfufot. So mechukot would mean, think of it, mechukot would be if he was pressing his hands very closely, like very tight, and gedushot would be if it was like loose and it was like more than his hands could actually hold. Ele tfufot, but rather it was just like a perfect measure. There's different interpretations about exactly what these words are. The Rambam's quoting from the Gemara, but basically he took a certain medium amount, hagadol, but that would fit precisely into his hands, with his fingers over his hands and with his thumbs pushing down on either side. Hagadol lefi gadol, katan lefi katno, v'notein letoch hakaf, and then he would take all of that and put it into the kaf. So that's what we're up to. Yes.
Letoch hakaf, that's the first full stop since the beginning.
Do you mean that's the first time that there's a period?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
And I asked myself if he didn't have a task list. Maybe he wrote it on his hand or something. I don't know. It's forbidden. It's forbidden. I don't know how he could remember all that.
Well, actually, no, it's a good
Maybe he
point.
had the book of the Rambam in his hands, or I don't know.
Okay, but let's remember way back in the first chapter. So
Taught him, I know.
Right, Michael Schwartz, you're nodding. So what would you say?
He was taught. They went through this with him, so that he would know it.
So he would know it. So so right, because as we know that many times in the later Second Temple period or after the time of Shimon HaTzadik, we know that not all of the Kohanim Gedolim were Mela, they weren't Talmidei Chachamim. Some of them were Mamash Burim va'amei haaretz, right? So they really had to teach them. So he got this crash course in the days leading up. And I'll also add in, I think, what's obvious, which of course he is surrounded by Kohanim who in fact are experts, right? So there are people there who are going to tell him, this is what you do next. And I will also say, even someone as great as Shimon HaTzadik, I'm sure would have been grateful. I mean, Lefi da'ati, I don't know, maybe this is not a nice thing, but I think it's respectful. On that day, the Kohen Gadol really has so many things to do in such a particular order, which is Paul's point. I think any Kohen Gadol would be grateful for, like, the Sgan, the people who are near him, who are saying to him, this is what we do next, this is what we do next, because it would be very easy to get things mixed up. But see here, Motzi'in lo, or like in the Mishnah, Hotziu lo, they did certain things for him, which would be the prompting. So when they bring that in front of him, he knows what to do. And the particular way that the Ketores was on the Gemara describes as I said, the Rambam here summarizes it. This was something he almost certainly would have had to practice on something else. It was, according to one opinion in the Gemara, which seems to be the dominant opinion, that this particular avodah of grabbing the Ketores was one of the harder avodot to do in the Beit HaMikdash, because you're grabbing something extremely fine. You're grabbing this extremely fine powder. You have to hold it in a certain way. As we see from the Mishnah, the way you hold it is what is established. That's what establishes the midah, right? So the midah is dependent on you holding it properly, and presumably the midah is important, right? Otherwise they say just throw some ketores in there and do what you will. But all of these things were very particular. So this is what we're up to now. And let's switch back to the Mishnah. And let's switch back now to the Bartanura. So the Bartanura says Chafan, right? Chafan melo chafna v'natan l'toch hakaf, hagadol lefi gadlo v'katan lefi kadno, and etc. V'kach hayta midata. This was its size. Bartanura says, Kimidata bachutz, kach midata bifnim. Ma bachutz haya chofen b'chofnav mamash, v'lo b'chli. Kach bifnim, kishima'areh haktoret min hakaf l'toch chofnav, lo haya ma'areh b'chli asui kamidat chofnav, el l'toch chofnav mamash. So, Bartun is explaining this a little bit differently than the way we thought in the pshat of the Mishnah. What does it mean? This was its measure. It means the measure its measure outside meaning now, when he's taking it in his hands, that was its measure inside, when he actually had to put the Ketores onto the coals. Just as on the outside, he would take it with his actual hands, and not with a kli. So also inside, when he pours the Ketores from the kaf into his hands, he wouldn't pour it with a kli, asui kamidat chofnav, el letoch chofnav mamash. In other words, he didn't pour it from a kli that held the Ketores that was exactly the size of his handfuls, but he would have to pour it into his hands and then put it onto the coals, which we'll see described later. So then, now he has two things. He has the kaf with the ktoret, and he has the machta with the coals. The Bartenu says, Natal machta bimino. He would take the coal pan in his right hand. So, the Bartenu says, Lafisha hi kveda b'chama, because it was heavy and it was hot. The chaf haktoret kala hemena. The kli that held the ktoret was lighter than it. The kach machta bimino v'chaf bismalo. That's why he put the coal pan in his right hand, and the kaf that had the ktoret in his left hand. The Bartenu, yes, go ahead.
This is assuming that the Kohen Gadol is always right-handed.
So actually, this brings up. It's a good question. I would phrase it a little bit differently. The question here might be, what do we mean by right and left? So, is the right hand always what we consider, like a universal right, or is the right hand the stronger hand? Now, I didn't delve into this for this particular avodah. I can tell you that in different areas of halacha, sometimes the right hand is simply defined as being the stronger hand. For example, in Hilchot Sofrut, both for, let's say, laying tefillin, you lay tefillin on your left hand, but what it means is you have to lay it on your weaker hand. So if you're left-handed, you lay tefillin on your right hand. And if you're right-handed, you lay it on your left hand. The sofer has to write with his right hand. So what is the right hand? It's the dominant hand. It's the hand that he normally writes with. So if you're left-handed, you have to write with your left hand. And if you're right-handed, you have to write with your right hand. So here in this context, again, I didn't try to go into this more deeply, but it's a question that occurred to me also. I might assume, based on what I'm bringing from Hilchot Sofrut, that this would apply here also, that if you had a left-handed Kohen Gadol, then he would pick up the machta with his left hand because that's his right. The way the terms are used in halachic literature, very often stam yamin means your stronger hand. And if you want to say the universal right, it says yamin shel olam, right? Right, yamina de kulei alma. There's a way of distinguishing it. But there are certain things where the right hand is absolute, even if you're left-handed. I think here I'll go out on a limb, and since I'm not in charge of the Beit HaMikdash this year. I believe that the right hand here means the dominant hand.
This also fits what we've learned so far about the measures being subjective to the Kohen himself. So
subjective or to use another term, relative. In other words, they're relative to the Kohen. They're relative to the Kohen Gadol himself. So I believe that would be the case here also, because that's the point. And one of the things, so the Bartenu here doesn't say this explicitly, but he's alluding to this question that I raised earlier, because you might say the avodah is the ktoret. The avodah. So you need the coals in order to do the avodah. But the main avodah is to take the ktoret and put it on the coals. So if that's the case, you might argue that he should pick up the kaf in his right hand, because that's the main avodah. And as I mentioned earlier, avodah with your left hand is pasul. But this is an exception. I'm sorry, hang on, there's some loud vehicle going by. Excuse me. So then, Hayam halech b'hechal, he would go and walk through the hechal. Nichnasim halech b'tocha l'ma'arav. he would enter and walk through it to the west. And then he would go Ad shemegiya levein shtei haparochot, until he got to in between the two parochot. So now, this is the Bartanura's explanation. Levein shtei haparochot, lefi shenistapku b'bayit sheni, im hamechitza hamavdelet ben hakodesh u'ben kodesh hakodeshim שהייתה בבית ראשון, והיה עוביה אמה, היא אותה אמה כלפנים, או כלחוץ. Because at the time of Bayit Sheni, the Chachamim were not sure about the division that divided between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim that had existed in the first temple, that they knew was one amma thick. If that amma was like kilifnim, in other words, was it counted in the measure of the Heichal, or was it counted in the measure of the Kodesh HaKodeshim? In other words, like this. I see Paul is shaking, he's like nodding his head back and forth. But as we've mentioned, beginning with the Mishkan, and then following up with Mikdash Shlomo, and then here we have Masechet Midot, and we have the vision of Yechezkel for Bayit Shlishi. In all of these places, the midot that are given, they're very precise. Everything is very, very precise, right? So in the Mishkan, let's just digress here for a moment. This is something that I did want to get into a little bit today. So let's digress for a moment and remind ourselves that in Shmot, when we get the commandment to make the parochet, so what does it say? V'asita parochet v'agaman v'tolat shani, etc. V'natata ota al arba amudei shitin. So you have to set up 4 amudim in the Mishkan itself. Mitzupim zahav, v'abahem zahav, arba'a adnei kasef. Then menatata et parochet tachat hakrasim. Okay, so if you remember the way this works, on the roof of the Mishkan, right, the immediate roof is going to be this yiriyah. There are 2 yiriyot that are connected by like hooks, and they get connected at the point that's going to divide between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. The length of the Mishkan is 30 amot. The width is 10 amot. So the hooks that connect the Yiriyot on top are going to connect at the 2/3 point, 20 amot from the entrance of the Kodesh, which is where these 4 amudim are. There are also going to be there's going to be these hooks on top. That's what you're going to hook the parochet to, coming down, right? I'm assuming that everybody has seen this in one form or another before. I didn't bring illustrations, and I can't find, for the life of me, this book, that the Mishkan book. I see Michael's getting up. Maybe he has a copy. You don't. I don't know if you're familiar. There was a really excellent book that came out dozens of years ago already, which I believe is still in print, where a person, I think, if I remember correctly, I think he was a Holocaust survivor, devoted his life to making this replica of the Mishkan, mostly according to Rashi's understanding. And he does this phenomenal job there was a book made that took very beautiful color pictures of every single part. Anyway, he does this very, very nicely. It was, of course, it wasn't to size, but it was to scale. So the point is that in the Mishkan, The thing that actually divides the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKodeshim is the Parochet. Now we don't know the exact thickness of the Parochet. For our purposes, right? So yeah, Seder, like Lo Mishaneh. It's as thick as like a thick piece of drapery is going to be. Presumably it was.
But it can't be an amma. And I never
Right.
saw a cloth which is
No,
an amma thick.
exactly. For sure it's not an amma. For sure it's not an amma. There's no indication that it's that thick. For purposes of dividing the Kodesh from the Kodesh HaKodeshim, it's as thick as whatever the thickness is, and we don't care. Because for
Something like
practical
a carpet or something, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be like a carpet, or even like the kind of parochet that they have on some of the aronot today, which are pretty thick. Okay, but how thick could it be? Maybe if you say it's 5 centimeter, like not like half a centimeter, or a centimeter, maybe even 2 centimeters. Okay, pseudo, but it's not an amma, like it's not that big. So that's the point. There's a single parochet. And for practical purposes, it makes this division that when you walk into the Kodesh, up to the Parochet, if you would take a tape measure, it would measure out 20 amot. You have to have an amot tape measure, but okay, it'll be 20 amot. And then measuring further, it's going to be 10 amot. Must speak. That's how we get that's clear. Everybody agrees on this in terms of the Mishkan. This is very clear, right? This is clear here about the Mishkan. But in Beit Sheni, it was not as clear. And here's the thing. I apologize because I was trying to find there's a reference in Malachim to it, and I'm not gonna. I thought I had it, and I think I lost it. Just a second.
Menachem is the first temple.
Yes, so that's the point. In the first temple, just a second. No, it's not here. I'm not looking in the right place. Um, but here, wait a second. I'll show you. In the first temple, there was a notion that the separation was an amah wide. For that, let me give you a different reference for now. 1 second.
Of your tefach, usfato.
Hold on a second. Let's look for a moment in Masechet Midot. So here in Masechet Midot, this is in the 4th chapter of Masechet Midot, in the 7th Mishnah. I'll just read through the beginning. We won't go into deep explanation. It says, Meha Mizrach and Ma'arav Meha Amad. This is describing now the Mikdash itself. Okay, so from east to west, in other words, from the eastern wall of the Mikdash to the western wall of the Mikdash, Mizrach Ma'arav Me'a Amma. That was 100 Amma. Kotel Ha'ulam Chamesh, the wall of the Ulam, which was in front of the Heichal, is 5 Amot. V'Ha'ulam Echadasar, the Ulam itself is 11. Kotel Ha'Eichal Shesh, v'tocho Arba'im Amma. V'tocho Arba'im Amma. Amma Traksin. Ve'esrim Amma Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim. This is the part that we need to understand. The Heichal, the inside of the Heichal was 40 Amot, right? The proportions are the same, that the first 2/3 are going to be Kodesh, and the last third is Kodesh HaKodeshim, like in the Mishkan. But in the Mishkan, it was 20 and 10. In Bayit Sheni, it was 40 and 20. So, but this is what it says. The inside of the Heichal was 40 Amma, And then there was an Amat Traksin, which we'll explain in a moment. The Amat Traksin, though, is this division. The division is called the Amat Traksin. The Esrim Amah Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim. And then there would be 20 Amah, which would be the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So let's look here for a moment at the Rambam. Let's skip the first part. Muvuar Katuv B'Bayit Rishon. Right? So in Tanakh, it tells us that Bayit Rishon, the length of the Heichal was 60, and it was 20 wide. Vayekodesh HaKodeshim bo hashlish, kamo hamishkan, v'hu esrim amah. So Bayit Rishon, when he says the Heichal, he means the whole Mikdash was 60 long, it was 20 wide, and the Kodesh HaKodeshim was a third of that length, like in the Mishkan, where the V'hu Esrim Amah in Bayit Rishon it was 20 Amah. V'Heichal Arba'im, the Heichal was 40. V'Hakotel Hamavdil, here he says V'Hakotel Hamavdil Bein HaHeichal V'Kodesh HaKodeshim V'hu HaNikra Traksin Haya Bo Petach V'Alav Parochet Achat. So there were in Bayit Rishon there was
there was a wall there.
Exactly, there was an actual wall
With the petach, with the
right. So because you had to have a way of getting in. So it had an opening, and the parochet would hang on the front of the wall. The kodesh hakodeshim v'hu anikra traksin hayabo petach v'yalav parochet achat. There was one parochet on it. V'haya lahem safek b'bayit sheni ba'ovi kotel hatraksin. So when they came to build Bayit Sheni, they weren't sure about the thickness of this Kotel Traksin, this wall of division. Imaya Michlal Ha'arba'im Shel Heichal. Because now, why was this such a big concern? Because the midot were supposed to be fixed. There were certain fixed midot. You couldn't add on because of this safek, you weren't allowed to make the Heichal an extra amma wider to account for the thickness of this wall. It had to fit into the 100. Let's see. In Bayit Rishon, it had to fit into this 60 amot length. So the question is, where do you put it? Does it count? Is it the last amma of the 40? That defines the Heichal, or is it the first Amah of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, which is 20, that defines the Kodesh HaKodeshim? Vayalehem safek b'bayit sheni ba'ovi kotel hatraksin im haya michlal ha'arba'im shel Heichal v'yeh im kein merchak haparochet mekotel ma'aravi esrim v'achat amot. So, right, the parochet you put on the front, meaning inside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, right? It's not on the front when you walk into the Eichal. Parochet has to be in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So if the Amma Traksin, if it was part of the 40, Imken Merchak HaParochet Mekotel Maravi Esrim V'Achat Amot, Osheya Kodesh HaKodeshim, or was that Amma, part of the Kodesh HaKodeshim, Ovi aparochet b'shlish b'diyuk. It would be exactly at the 1/3 point. L'fikach asu ovi hakotel michutz l'midat ha'echal b'kodesh HaKodeshim. So therefore they made the thickness of the wall outside of the midah of the heichal and the Kodesh HaKodeshim. V'talu alav parochet mibifnim. Uparochet mibachutz, kedei she'atraksin ben shtei parochot, So in other words, in Bayit Sheni, they didn't build a wall, but they hung two curtains. V'nimtza beinehem amma, and there was one amma between the curtains. K'moshe be'erna b'chamishi de Kippurim, which is where we are in the 5th chapter of Yoma. Vayta klaluto klomar kol ha'hechal me'al me'al. All of the hechal was 100 on 100 amot. Ela shayu mitzadedin et binyan ma'at. Okay, this is a separate issue at the end. Hayu mitzadedin binyan ma'at kedei sheyeh kazeh tsar mipat ma'arav v'kol sheyotze lemizrach mitrachev. That it was actually slightly, the walls were built slightly narrower at the western side, and they came out at a slight angle to the eastern side. Kitavnita aryeh asher lefanav rachav yoter miacharav. So it would be like a lion that is wider in front than it is in the back. That's a separate issue. So this is the Amat Raksin, and
Looks like a problem of brutto and netto, and it's very important for the Arnona. Because when you have to pay the Arnona, that you have to take the wall in the middle of the wall.
that would be, I have to tell you, that would be great skit for a Purim spiel. Like when the people from the Uriah come to the Heichal, they say, "Nu." That's very good. Yeah, and of course that's true, right? Because I remember actually one time when they were measured. This is a long time ago. I had a house in Ramot, and the fellow who came to measure, he was very honest with us. He said, "Look, it depends how I measure." And he was lenient with us. He said, like if I don't count the walls here and I don't count the walls here, like it, right? It reduces your Arnona. So yes, this is an Arnona question.
So one thing that strikes me is that in Tanakh it says that the put is maseh choshev, which Rashi interprets to mean a form of weaving with this different pattern on each side, and it occurs to me that when you've got the parochet facing a wall, when you've got one parochet facing another wall, in some sense it's pointless to have that form of weaving. And so I'm wondering if in fact that art had been lost by that point.
I think it's a good question. And I've also been wondering about this. I've been wondering about it myself, and I don't know the answer because it sounds like even by the time that they built Beit Rishon, right? According to this, right, you're only seeing one side of the parochet. So the question, and also the parochet that was in Beit Rishon could not have been, even if they still had the parochet from the Mishkan, it wouldn't have been the same because it wasn't big enough. The Beit Rishon was substantially bigger. You would need a much bigger parochet. So obviously they had to make a new parochet. So how is that? To put the question simply, how is that parochet made, and how are the parochot according to the Chachamim? Were there two parochot in Bayit Sheni? How were they made? Did they still fulfill the Maseh Choshev that's described in Shmot? And did they have to, right? Or what? Or was the were those instructions particular to the Mishkan, and they didn't necessarily apply to the later Batei Mikdash? Yeah, I mean, look, there are other aspects to this which we only lightly touch on, which is you can ask a more general question. What was the heter to build the Beit HaMikdash using measures that were not the same measures as the Mishkan, right? The Torah tells us the size of the Mishkan. How do
They
we
are
know that you
double.
can? Yeah, right, how do we know that you can double the size? That you can change the size so substantially?
But
So
Yecheskel does it even bigger.
yes, and
Huge,
so
huge.
the pasuk that's pointed. There's a pasuk that's pointed to, which I think I can bring up. Hold on a second. There's a pasuk in Divrei Hayamim where David says when he tells Shlomo, this is in the rendition that's in Divrei Hayamim, when he tells Shlomo that he has to build the Beit HaMikdash, he says that Hakol Alai Hakol I'm not going to get the word in Hakol Alai Bichtav Miyad Hashem, that he had that David had a like a revelation from Hashem about how to build the Beit HaMikdash. And that's something though which we know. It goes into a lot of detail in Divrei Hayamim. He prepared for it. It wasn't just that he had the idea. He did a lot of the actual groundwork and preparation for it. And the idea is that he had already he had like the blueprint as a kind of a divine revelation. So there is this idea that there's there's certain aspects of the Mishkan, then Mikdash, that get passed down. Certain aspects are constant, but then certain aspects are changed with each iteration. One of the things that we don't talk about is, in fact, what Beit Sheni looked like before the renovation under Hordus, which is that's the Beit HaMikdash that we're talking about in Masechet Midot. This was not the same Mikdash that was built in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It underwent a major renovation in the time of Hordus with the coordination of the Chachamim. But that's what we're talking about. I don't know, and again, I apologize. It's not something that I've delved into, but I haven't come across, even by happenstance, descriptions of the temple prior, the second temple prior to this time. And there also I don't know. But let me see if I can quote something for you. Just a second. We're not going to finish this Mishnah today. We're gonna pick up from this next week because I have to stop. But I want to let me see if I can find this. Hold on. No, it's not here. If there's a comment. I think it's by the Tosas Yom Tov. Let's see if I can get it. Parshanut, Tosas Yom Tov. Here. So this is a comment. It's basically from the Rambam. This is the wait. Do I have this on screen? Yes. This is the introduction of the Tosas Yom Tov to Masechet Midot. He quotes the Rambam. The Rambam says, "Hevi achar tamid midot." The Rambam says that the Mishnah of Midot is brought after Masechet Tamid, and there's nothing else in it except the description of the dimensions of the Beit HaMikdash and its form and its construction and all of its aspects. And the point, v'to'elet sheyesh binyan, right? The point of doing this is that, and this is what's so interesting, is ki kishiyibaneh beit bechira, when the next Beit HaMikdash is going to be built, yesh lishmor v'lasot hatavniyot hahu, rahaim, v'atochniot v'tzurot, v'ha'erech mipnei shehu beruach hakodesh. Right, the idea is that you have to keep the basic structures and the basic plans and forms because that they were given beruach hakodesh. Kamosh Amar, and here he quotes this pasuk, Hakol bichtav miyad Hashem, Hakol bichtav miyad Hashem alai hiskil. That's the pasuk that David says in Divrei Hayamim. Yafal pi shehabin ad kam l'shana. So that's what the Rambam says. So now the Tosas Yom Tov adds on, Af al pi shebinyan shel atid yesh bo shinuyim. Even though the future Beit HaMikdash, the third Beit HaMikdash, will have changes, lo yishvuim binyan bayit sheni, u'komo shir'eh ha'ma'ayen b'mishnah u'b'sefer Yechezkel, v'Rambam atzmo katav b'tchilat hilchot Beit HaBechira. Right, so even though the next Beit HaMikdash is going to be different, and the Rambam himself says this in Hilchot Beit HaBechira, he says, Binyan Shlomo kvar mefurash b'mlachim, v'chein binyan ha'atid lihibanot, and similarly the Beit HaMikdash that will be built in the future. Af al pi shehu katuv b'Yechezkel, eino mefurash u'mevuar. Even though the plans for the third Beit HaMikdash are written in Sefer Yechezkel, they're not expressly fleshed out and explained. The Anshe Bayit Sheni, so the people who built Bayit Sheni, Kishibanu Bimei Ezra, Banuhu Kevinyan Shlomo, Ume'ein Dvarim HaMefurashim B'Yechezkel. The people who built Bayit Sheni based it on the way Shlomo built the temple and on things that they saw in the Chazon of Yechezkel. Adkan. Hare she'ein, that's from the Rambam says in Hilchot Beit HaBechira. Hare she'ein bebinyan bayit sheni ela me'ein dvarim hamefurashim b'Yechezkel, aval lo kechol hakatuv b'Sefer Shav. So there's certain things that were taken from Sefer Yechezkel, and we saw, for example, we saw one of them, right? We talked about the pishpishim that are on the entrance to the Heichal. Right, there are the wickets that are on each side. There are like small doors on the two big doors of the Heichal. So we said the south one. It says in the Mishnah, the south one was never opened, and they quote a pasuk from Yechezkel. There's a pasuk in Yechezkel that says that door is closed, and that's because that's the door. Only Hashem can go through that door, as it were. Right, so. That was in Bayit Sheni, but they were taking something from Yechezkel. Avani b'hakdamati l'sefer tzurat habayit, and I, the Tosas Yom Tov, in my introduction to the book about the form of the temple, natati tuv tam b'ze al pi hamidrash nimtza b'perush Rashi Yechezkel, siman mem gimel. Ru'uya ita biyah shniya shel Ezra eliyot k'biyah harishona sheyeshu v'chulei. So, I think I mentioned this before, and I actually have now it's a printed copy. Anybody who's interested, I think I could get copies of these for you. The people who hired me to write a Sefer Torah a few years ago, the husband is a direct descendant of the Baal Tosas Yom Tov of Yom Tov in Heller. And he funded the publication of the Tosas Yom Tov's book, which is he wrote a book on Surat HaBayit, as described in the Sefer Yechezkel. So he commissioned this to be published in Hebrew with an English translation, and they gave me a copy. It's on my It's on my shelf here. So that's what the Tosas Yom Tov is quoting himself here. Right? He's saying, so this is what I said in my introduction to that book, that even that the second coming of Ezra, in other words, when the people came from Babel with Ezra, that was worthy of being like the first coming into the land of Yoshua. Binyan ze me'az haya ra'ui lahem kishalu min ha'gola gulat olam ela shegaram achet lo hayta tshuvatam hogen v'chule. Right? In other words, in principle, when they built when they built Beit Sheni, that was Ra'ui to be the last Beit HaMikdash, but they blew it, and the temple was destroyed, and they got kicked out. So he says, "L'kacha ni omer shelefi shelo hayta tshuvatam hogenet," because their tshuva was not proper. Lo yuchlu limla'oto b'chol chalkei binyan kamot shuhu. They weren't able to fill out all of the parts of the structure as it was. L'fi she'oto binyan miu'ad legulat olam, shetehei kavod choneh le'olam. Kinyan shneimar v'shachanti b'tocham le'olam. In other words, there's a certain final ideal of the structure of the Beit HaMikdash, which will establish it as the permanent home of the Shekhinah. Umikol makom ho'il v'haya ra'ui lahem. Nonetheless, they were worthy of having made such a structure. Ra'u ki tov livnot me'ein oto ha'binyan b'miktzat min advarim ad kan da'ati sham. So he makes this argument, the Kitzur, that they were worthy of having made the final Beit HaMikdash, and so they do take some aspects of the structure from Yechezkel. ועם כל זה יפה כתב הרמב"ם שסיפור העניין בבית שני יש בו תועלת לעתיד מצד דברים רבים הדומים, וגם זה הביא לראיה ממה שנאמר כל בכתב מיד השם עלי השכיל, אף על פי שדוד הוא שאמר כן לשלמה בנו בעניין הראשון, מכל מקום יש ראיה ממנו, וכמו שבמשנה ב' פרק בתר דסוכה, okay, so you know what? I don't have to go through the whole thing. We're running out of time. But what he's making an argument here that, and I'll put it in different words. The specific structure, the specific midot, and many of these very detailed aspects of the Beit HaMikdash were decided for each Beit HaMikdash. So he's making the argument that there were certain things that were common to all of them, and then beginning with certainly with the second temple borrows from the first temple, but also looked to the vision of Yechezkel of the third temple to try to make a temple that would be the last temple, that would be the permanent temple. So, but okay, I think I'll just end here. I'll end here for now. I think this is just, something to think about. But again, it brings up this question. We have a Masechet that's called Masechet Midot, right? The name of the Masechet is measurements. And it follows from what we see in the Torah, and what we see in Sefer Melachim, and what we see in Divrei Yamim, what we see in Yechezkel, that there was a very big hakpadah on the exact measurements. They were significant. And I'll end off by saying, and anyone who's interested, I can send you a link to this. There's a paper, an essay in Hebrew. I don't know if it was translated in a magazine here in Israel. It's called Skula Magazine, which is a magazine that deals mainly with Jewish history and Israeli history and stuff like that. There's a great essay about how Sir Isaac Newton was completely taken with the idea that the secrets of the universe, were directly related to the structure of the temple. And you may know that he was also a Hebrew scholar. He studied Tanakh, he studied Talmud, and he devoted many years of his life to trying to like squeeze out the secrets of, like these universal type secrets, which he thought were embedded in the structure and in the measurements of the Beit HaMikdash. So anyone who's interested, they don't bring the actual research in the paper, but they give you a lot of the background. I don't think he figured it out. And also, he thought that the Jews were anyway kaput. Like, the Jew, like he did go with the Christian idea of replacement theology, but nonetheless, he saw that there were very important things that the Jews had to contribute to this. So, not to bring a raya from Sir Isaac Newton, but even Sir Isaac Newton, even a non-Jew, understood that there were certain universal truths that were embedded in the measurements of the Beit HaMikdash. So that's it. Next week we'll pick up on this again, and we'll continue. So thank you, everybody. One other thing. I think we will meet next week, and then after that, I'm going to the States. I don't think we'll meet the following week, but I'll be in touch. And then after that, we should pick up. I'll be in the States for like 3 months. So I think I'm going to miss at least a week. If I, for right now, assume though that we'll meet next Monday, I've run out of time, in which case I'll tell everybody.
You're going to work on the Sefer Torah?
Bezrat Hashem. Okay.
All
Have
right.
a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.
יישר כוח.
Good night.
Night. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.